In this episode of Defining Diabetes, Jenny Smith and I are going to define basal. Seems simple, doesn't it? Maybe it's not. Maybe it means more than you think. Defining Diabetes is made possible by Dexcom, Omnipod, and Dancing for Diabetes. Hang out for just a couple moments after Jenny and I define basal and find out more about them all. Please remember that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise, and to always consult a physician before becoming bold with insulin or making any changes to your medical plan. Hey, Jenny, let's define basal. I'm going to go first this time.
Okay.
I'm online, right? So basal outside of diabetes is just forming or belonging to a bottom layer or a base, which makes sense when you translate it to diabetes, right? Because it's a baseline of insulin, right? It's that kind of layer of insulin that, we talk about all the time on the podcast. Like, when you hear me tell you during like a higher carb meal, I think we called it a carbier meal one time. I said, I like to lay a blanket of basal over top of the lifetime of that food. So that makes sense. But how would you define basal for diabetes?
So basal for diabetes, essentially, in those who inject, it's a long-acting insulin. You usually inject it once or twice a day, and it covers the background need, the physiologic need for insulin that your own pancreas would do as a drip, 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 drip all day long. Basal insulin has no technical reason to cover food, right? We know that it does if you're doing other things and the potential need to increase or decrease. But in this definition, basal truly covers your physiologic need for a background insulin. And we all need it in our body at all times. Even people without diabetes, their pancreas goes drip, 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 drip. If you're on a pump, it goes drip, drip, drip at a rate. If you're taking an injected basal, it is absorbed from the site that you would inject it at once or twice a day over a long period of time.
You don't want to miss the Diabetes Pro Tip series that Jenny and I did recently. It begins back at episode 210 with Diabetes Pro Tip Newly Diagnosed or Starting Over. After that, it's episode 211, all about MDI. Episode 212, all about insulin. In episode 217, we talk about pre-bolusing. In 218, temp basaling. In 219, insulin pumping. In 224, mastering your CGM. In 225, bumping and nudging. In 226, the perfect bolus. And in 231, we talk about variables. The latest installment just went up a few days ago, and it's about setting your basal rates. Defining Diabetes on the Juicebox Podcast is brought to you by Dexcom, Omnipod, and Dancing for Diabetes. There are links in the show notes and at juiceboxpodcast.com to all the wonderful sponsors. But if you want to find out more about getting a free, no-obligation demo of the Omnipod, you can go to myomnipod.com/juicebox. To get started on the Dexcom G6 continuous glucose monitor, dexcom.com/juicebox. And to learn about the good that's being done at Dancing for Diabetes, go to dancing4diabetes.com. Thanks for checking out Defining Diabetes. Come back every Friday as Jenny and I break down a new word or phrase that is impacting your life with type 1 diabetes.